You wanted to say you want to know the fastest indicator of the health of your business, the power of your marketing, and whether or not you're reaping cult brand benefits. I'd have you first and foremost look at we are pricing in your category. Are you avoiding being the low-cost provider? Second would be the percentage of goods or services you sell at full price, meaning that you're no longer bribing people or have constant stimulation into the marketplace, but people are seeking it out to pay full price and often a premium price. And then third, we look at unsolicited resumes or applications to work for you.
If you've ever looked a bit enviously at those brands whose customers are so loyal that they'll pay a premium for their products, endure long waits for access, and can't be persuaded to switch brands regardless of the offer, and if you've wondered how you might be able to add some of that secret sauce to your business, then this is the podcast for you. What do companies like Apple, Harley Davidson, and Disney, for example, do differently that turn their customers into loyal fans? What is it that makes people want more of these brands' products, regardless of the price? Hi, I'm Jane Singer, and thank you for taking time out of your day to join me here on A Seat at the Table. It's really a pleasure to have your company, and I hope that you're enjoying learning from the many industry leaders, innovators, entrepreneurs, and authors who were guests on the show, and that, like me, you benefit from their experience, expertise, and insights. The advantages of creating a cult brand are massive, from customer loyalty to premium prices and enviable profit margins. Let's face it, it's difficult not to be a little bit awed by Apple's nearly $4 trillion valuation. The brand's value now exceeds many countries' total GDP. Hard to believe, right? To learn more about how the rest of us can build brands that enjoy cult-like status, I reached out to Chris Nealand, co-founder of Cult Collective and The Gathering. Chris and his team have dedicated themselves to deciphering how businesses can create fanatical customers and engaged employees. We talk not only about consumer brands, but also about what B2B companies can do. In this podcast, Chris shares his 8 cult brand principles. That's a blueprint, really, for any business who wants to develop cult-like customers. The 8 things that differentiate cult brands from everyone else, and what you need to measure to determine if your brand is a cult. Before we get started, if you're a fashion industry executive and are constantly feeling overwhelmed by the daily deluge of information and news, some of which is really just noise, isn't it? Then why not take a look at Inside Fashion's news briefings? You can get concise executive summaries of top news and industry trends that keep you up to date in just a few minutes. You can learn more at InsideFashionLive.net. That's InsideFashionLive.net. I'll put a link in the show notes and on A Seat at the Table's website. Okay, now we may not be able to achieve Apple's cult-like status, but let's find out how we might be able to get close. I'm totally excited to have you on the show, Chris. Brand loyalty is something everybody struggles with. What does it take, from your experience, to take a brand and turn it into a cult brand?
At the end of the day, the most important ingredient is your ambition or your desire. I'm so often disappointed at how many business leaders seem content with having just a mediocre business, some marginal year-over-year growth, just transactional relationships with consumers who they have to continue to bribe through discounts and sales promotions to get them to come back again. And they think that they somehow achieved some level of success. And I guess, to be fair, they have achieved some level of success. Anybody that can, make a business that can support their family or employ other people is noteworthy and respectable. We look at most businesses as having so much untapped potential, and that if they just elevated their ambitions for what their company could do, they could achieve so much more than just greater financial rewards. But, I like to say, stop chasing profit and start chasing prosperity. And being prosperous is profitable plus a whole bunch of other desirable attributes as well.
That's such an important point, and I really love the way you phrase it, because I think a lot of times people think that if you're not really chasing the profits, you won't succeed. So they're like, you have to chase the profits. That's the most important thing. And it is, like you said, you have to be able to survive. But at the same time, being able to build that kind of brand that people love doesn't have to be necessarily, as you're saying, in lieu of profits. It can be on top of it. So, where does one start? I think a lot of people understand the concept, me too, but oftentimes you don't know where to start, right? What's the first step?
Well, and you're asking specifically, how do they start to create a cult brand versus just create a company?
Yeah, in other words, if you were running some brand and you say, I want to turn this into a cult brand, what do you do? Where would you start?
I think that the number one difference between a leader of a cult brand and versus a mediocre brand would be their emphasis on advocacy versus awareness. Mediocre brands think that their job is to get more people to know them. Therefore, they spend most of their energy on paid media or earned media trying to create conversation about them, usually by creating the conversation themselves, buying the commercial, buying the ad, versus a cult brand leader realizes you knowing me is the beginning of my objective, not the end. What I need you to do is know me so well that you then go get your friends and family to get to know me also. And creating advocates has nothing to do with creating advertising. Creating advocates has everything to do with the customer experience. And you put all of those discretionary dollars not into paid media, but rather into enhancing your value propositions or the customer experience so that you become buzzworthy, or what we like to say, remarkable, meaning people are now remarking about you. Therefore, you don't have to be the one that's talking about yourself all the time. They're doing it for you.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. But how do you apply that to a product that might be important for people to have, but not remarkable in that way? In other words, if you have an iPhone, you've got an inbuilt part that's interesting, that's fascinating for people. If you're selling something like basic clothing, for example, how do you then turn that, in other words, into something that becomes that remarkable?
So you typically would look at three criteria. We always like to start with the product itself. And the reality is there's just too many people selling too many bad or lame or mediocre products. So I don't subscribe to the fact that we need, 19 ranch dressings at the grocery store or 17 different brands of toilet paper. At some point, you have to ask yourself, why are we even selling this product? Consumers already have ample available to them, and it's become just completely commoditized. But we always try to start with, is there something in your product that could be considered more remarkable? If not, then we go to some form of service delivery. Could your warranty be enhanced, or your return policy? I'm reminded of, there's a company here in America called Traeger Grills, and the grill itself, which is actually a smoker, is pretty remarkable, but the way that it's packaged and shipped to you is even more remarkable. And the whole box that it comes in can be turned inside out, and it's a log cabin for your children to play in, right? Somebody was thinking about, well, the grill is great, but let me make sure that the way that it arrives, the way that it's assembled can be even great. And if you can't do either of those, then you have to create some form of brand affinity or customer experience that has really nothing to do with your core product. So I remember working, getting to know the folks at Converse a few years ago, and there's really nothing that special about the Converse shoe. It's the same leather and canvas that you'd find in a Skechers or in an Airwalk or in a Vans. There's also really not that much special about the buying experience because they don't even sell the shoe. They're in the same retail stores that all their other competitors are in. So Converse had to create, what does it mean to be a Converse customer? And they needed to own some form of lifestyle. And they tapped into skate culture, and they used their brand to propagate creativity and music and skating. And that's what attracted people to their brand. So they had to bolt that onto the brand experience because they didn't have the product or service advantage that they would like to have had. So usually with one of those three areas, the product, the incremental value, add services, or some sort of customer experience or brand relationship, I think that you'll have a better shot than not of creating something that really creates desirable distinction for you.
We're going to take a quick break now, and then we'll be right back.
We were hiring when we were making 50 to 100K monthly losses.
And why? Welcome to episode 1.
I can't think of a single founder who's been around for a decent amount of time in business who hasn't had their tunnel of year. This was that year. We're going to be okay, yeah, Sheree. Some are going to hear this and think, you TDP. But hear me out. You only have to do the math to understand that very soon we were $500,000 down.
Wow, that's really interesting. And, as I'm listening to you talk, I'm actually getting ideas myself. It's true. Sometimes you really need someone like yourself to come onto the scene and be a catalyst, right? To get you to think, because whatever business you're doing, you tend to have certain ways of looking at things, thought patterns, and so forth. And you don't necessarily, in my opinion, need someone who's a disruptor. I think that frightens a lot of people, myself included. I mean, nobody wants your business disrupted. But I think sometimes somebody adding just a little bit of spice to the sauce is important, because it actually gets you to think about stuff that you don't normally think about in the course of your day-to-day business.
Yeah, it's a bit of a curse, frankly, because I go into most businesses now just wanting to pull the manager to the side and said, listen, have you ever thought about this? Or, this could have been so much better. And unfortunately, we live in a society of quick fixes, and we live in a society of, rapid weight loss pills.
Right.
And most of the time they don't work. But yet people buy them because they want things to be fast and easy. And building a cult brand isn't fast and easy. Building a cult brand is going to the gym every day at 6 a.m. and working out for an hour and not eating that donut for breakfast, and not having the chips after lunch. And it's hard. You have to make sacrifices and you have to put in the work. But we've just seen it's so much more fulfilling. The people that work forget the customers. I mean, customers love cult brands, but employees love cult brands. The leadership team loves cult brands. You think about some of the richest people in the world, they don't have to make all their money from their business so that they can then go do something amazing outside of their business. They're using their business to fulfill their personal, ambitions and live sort of that Maslowian, top of the pyramid in terms of all their hierarchy of needs. And they're using their business as a vehicle to do that, as opposed to just as a vehicle to fund it.
Right. Yeah, I think that's really an interesting way of framing it. If you will, you talked about 8 principles. What are your 8 principles for building this kind of brand?
So about a decade ago, when we started really being curious about why were some brands achieving so much greater level of success than their category peers, despite not doing what their category peers were doing, most often in the form of these cult brands were charging premium price points when everybody else tended to be slashing prices. And the cult brands weren't discounting to the same degree that their mediocre peers were. So they were preserving so much more margin. And this was like right in the throes of the Great Recession here in North America. So when people were kind of claiming everybody's broke and there's rampant unemployment, I mean, those were some of the best years for Starbucks or Porsche or Apple or Netflix. I mean, all these premium brands were birthed in that sort of situation. So it's just so fascinating to us as how are they Beats by Dre headphones? Like they were 4 times more expensive. Yeti coolers, right? Was birthed in 2006 and kind of went mainstream in 2010, 2011. So we were looking at those businesses and trying to reverse engineer what they were doing. And the first and most important thing was it wasn't just their behavior, it was their belief systems. Like they just had a different paradigm. Like I mentioned, you asked your first question, it was their ambition that was as notable as their actions, and their beliefs that were as impactful as their behaviors. They're just wired differently. And that's that's almost the hardest thing to do, is to change somebody's mind. But you have to really do that before you can change their behavior. So then we just started doing pattern matching. Jim Collins had written a book 20 years ago called Good to Great, where he kind of reverse engineered the most successful stock performing companies and found 6 things that these top performers were doing. So that's a pretty good framework that we should try to copy. And we found 8 attributes that cult brands did disproportionately more often and better than their mediocre peers. So just to rumble through them really quickly. The first has to do with remarkability. But that's kind of a play on words because it's not synonymous with being extraordinary or exceptional. It's more synonymous with being buzzworthy or notable. The root of remarkability is to remark. And cult brands were very, very intentional about here's something that we're doing that's going to get everybody talking. And therefore, again, the bigger that conversation, the less they then have to contribute to it. So Tesla spends no money on advertising, but they put video games into the dashboard iPad, right? And it's like that creates some conversational capital. The second is having a purpose. Now, this has become probably the most vogue of the 8 cult brand principles. Simon Sinek and Start With Why. He also sort of decoded the same thing that we had observed, but we've seen it in cult brands going back 100 years. Like this is not a recent phenomenon. It's just kind of a recent management fad. But, John Deere or Jack Daniels has been doing, Levi's Jeans has been dealing with a purpose-based brand proposition. And it's manifest in what you spend your time talking about. Non-cult brands talk about what they sell. Cult brands talk about what they stand for. And so you'll see a disproportionate amount of the dialogue, the conversation, the advertising being more about purpose versus, look at a Coca-Cola ad. It's going to be very hard to find Coca-Cola saying, buy this weekend, get a 6-pack for $2.99. Instead, it's people standing on a hill, holding hands, singing a song, and teaching the world to sing. And it's because they want to be associated with culture and harmony and happiness as opposed to just discounts and deals. Make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
The third deals with building from the inside out. Cult brands tend to be some of the best places to work. Cult brand leaders spend a disproportionate amount of their time and money on culture as opposed to just on communications. So some of the best cult brand leaders, I think of like Netflix right now. Netflix is probably the best company in the past 15 years that has reimagined itself. You mentioned disruption before. They've literally disrupted their business, self-imposed, self-inflicted disruption 3 times. And it's because they focused on a specific culture of performance that transcended their category, which is how they could keep changing the business that they're in because that wasn't the culture. They weren't in the DVD business, right? And so therefore they could transcend that. Fourth deals with co-creation. It's one of my favorites. Co-creation values customers for more than just their dollar, but it values them for their voice, and that voice in the form of feedback and input, and that voice in the form of referrals. So they just have better mechanisms to create dialogue and to get people to be vested. Lego is my favorite story in that way. Lego fired their R&D department and just gave the microphone to 10,000 master builders and said, you guys decide amongst yourselves what you want us to do, and then we'll go do it because you're our biggest fans. You know what we need better than we do. Number 5 is congregate. That's been a tough one in a pandemic where social distance is required, but there's something very special about bringing your best fans together and letting them sort of revel in their togetherness. And in some cases, you don't even host the party. Like when I think of Harley Davidson and the largest motorcycle rally in North America, which happens in Sturgis, South Dakota, that's not a Harley Davidson sponsored event. That wasn't like Harley Davidson created that. Motorcycle enthusiasts created that, and Harley Davidson showed up with the beer and the pizza and said, hey, this is a great party. And it became a way for people to express their enthusiasm. And you look at some of the best brands, whether it's the Apple store in New York, that becomes a temple for people to go to the altar of Apple and to worship. It could be a Hall of Fame, like the Hall of Fame for baseball or the NFL or rock and roll, right? You try to create places in the B2B space. It could be Salesforce, or Dreamforce. Dreamforce is a business conference for Salesforce, and like hundreds of thousands of people pay money to show up to a B2B commercial, basically. I mean, it's just a trade show, but they made it something that was desirable and aspirational. 3 more. You asked, so sorry, I'm taking all this airtime on this, but careful what you asked for, Jane.
Oh no, I think it's interesting. Like I said, I'm taking notes.
The 5th one, I think I'm on 5, maybe 6, it's called rites and rituals. The creation of rites and rituals. It's the most pure principle from legitimate cults, and maybe less controversial than cults, but maybe say religions or fraternities or sororities. There are certain things that organizations do that indicate insider, whether, it's the stereotypical secret handshake or password. But, you think about Apple, the ultimate cult brand, the first to get to the $3 trillion valuation. Everything about Apple is a closed system unique to Apple. You don't text, you iMessage. You don't video chat, you FaceTime, right? It's like they have their own language. They have their own swiping. They have their own methodology. They have their own, and sometimes it can be very superficial, like dunking an Oreo cookie or the Jeep two-finger wave to other Jeep drivers. But cult brands don't take that for granted. They understand there's great power in the use of symbols and language and little rites and rituals that make their product more beloved. The last two, so the number 7 is about being relatable. The less customers don't fall in love with companies. Customers fall in love with companies that look and feel like they're friends. So the more relatable you can become, and that's certainly Disney's secret sauce. I think it's what's made Airbnb so popular so quickly. Is Airbnb just became like the friendly neighbor that will let you sleep on their couch, right?
Right.
And it's their use of imagery. It's the way that their call center answers the phone. It's their empathy with which they deal with pricing or returns. Like it's not just like, having a spokesperson. It's not just, Flo from Progressive Insurance. It's a systemic way with which the company is going to behave in very humane, very competent, very warm, endearing attributes. Lululemon always comes to mind of like Lululemon is women's aspirational fit best friend that they wish they were.
Right.
Harley Davidson is most people that drive a Harley are me, middle-aged, overweight, bald accountants. But you never see me in their ads.
Right.
Because nobody wants to be me, right? Everybody wants to be the badass, the outlaw. So they lean into that personification so that I can escape my reality and become this make-believe guy that that's why I spend $25,000 for the bike, not because it costs $25,000, but it's fulfilling some fantasy I have of a life with no rules.
Right.
And then the last one is probably the most provocative. It's that we like to refer to it as the darker arts of cult branding, because if you do it wrong, you end up in a lawsuit, but it's called picking a fight.
Oh.
And too many brands try to be the hero, but nobody really knows what the villain is. And so what did you actually conquer? And so cult brands do a great job of dialing up their villain. Now, in some cases, it's abused, like, political advertising would be the worst. Like my villain is my opponent. I vilify him, and that becomes mudslinging. That's not very fun. That's not endearing. But if you have the I'm an Apple, he's a PC campaign. We all know the PC guy is Microsoft, but they're not saying Microsoft. My favorite example of picking a fight is Snickers. Snickers completely recategorized itself. It's not even a candy bar anymore. It's more like a meal replacement, because it's their fight was against hangriness, and you're not yourself when you're hungry, and going after that 3 o'clock, crave. And so their villain became, we can all appreciate that. In fact, they even put they didn't even say Snickers on the package anymore. It says something like irritable, right? Some negative symptom of being hungry, because that's what they're fighting against.
Right.
And so it's just a brilliant bit of cult branding. So, not every brand is going to excel at all 8 of those, but you should be doing 4 or 5 of them better than the other competitors in your category if you hope to start to reap the benefits of market share and word of mouth and advocacy that cult brands get.
I think that's really interesting. And, as you're talking, I'm sort of listening to this, and I am thinking of different brands that come to mind, a lot of the ones that you brought up, that have been able to do this. And what you're saying is really true. That's exactly what they've done. And you pointed out in principles that make it sound like a science, but it seems to me that there's also a bit of an art value to that as well. You need to have a certain sense of the artist as well as the scientists to be able to pull this off successfully.
Oh, 100%. I mean, marketing is art and science. And I think where brands go astray is when they over-index one way or the other. They either go all art and they're doing ridiculous fragrance commercials where it doesn't even make sense, but people are raving about the beautiful production. Or they go all science, and now it's all just performance-based, programmatic digital media buying and optimizing campaign ROI. And it really is that balance. And people always try to ask me about how cult capable their business is. And I said, you got to stop thinking about your category, because most categories have cult-like potential that isn't being recognized. I don't care if you're selling toilet paper or copy machines, but you have to start thinking about your courage and your creativity. Right. Because what's going to usually prevent you from achieving cult-like status is you're going to get scared because we're asking you to do something that's non-traditional. And that's the whole point. If everybody else is doing it, you're just going to be one of the same. Or it's just got to be really creative. I mean, it's one thing for Snickers to say, let's fight hangriness. But it's another thing to say, let's get Betty White to do a Super Bowl commercial and knock her over and, create some conversation through a really fun execution. Or, Red Bull dropping a guy out of space. I mean, those are, that was one of the most courageous and creative campaigns I'd ever experienced. Because there's a good chance he's dying and Red Bull's filming it for 80 million people to watch.
Oh, God.
That's terrifying.
Yes,
right?
It is.
And so, but when you pull that off, that's how a drink that by their own data would suggest not many people like its taste, and it's more expensive than the competitive alternative, can achieve billions of dollars of revenue. It's because they do display courage and creativity, unlike their category competitors.
Right. Yeah, I think that's interesting to point that out. It's not easy for most to be able to pull off something that extreme, but I think it is a good example. I'd like to touch on social media because I think that there's a lot of confusion surrounding that. A lot of people feel they're building engagement because they're posting like mad on social media, getting likes, right? Getting views. Is that, from your point of view, the kind of engagement and building that, cult type of a persona that you're talking about? I mean, how do you see that? What's your take on it?
Well, I feel like marketers ruined social media the way that we ruined email 10 years before. I mean, email had a wonderful potential to become this interactivity tool that streamlined operations, reduced cost. And rather than treating it as a way to improve customer relationships, they treated it like the newspaper or the radio or a billboard, and they started filling inboxes with unwanted advertisements. And social media, to me, is 10% social and 90% media today. It's just another media channel that businesses are using to try to push a message out. And it goes against that fourth principle I told you about, a co-creation, where if you truly want engagement, you're going into the social spaces to listen more than you are to talk. And you're not just going in to get lame sentiment scores, but you're going into deep Reddit communities of power users, of if you're in Star Wars or if you're into cars or you're into jewelry, you got to go to the Pinterest pages or the Reddit pages or watch the TikTok videos and observe. You have to appreciate that what you have is a window into what people are actually thinking, feeling, and doing, as opposed to fabricated research surveys where I don't believe anybody says what they actually do and nobody does what they mean. It's artificial. But in the social spaces, it's legitimate. But don't go in there and just trying to convert or convince people. Go in to contribute in a meaningful way to the conversations that are happening organically. So I like social media. I just wish that we stopped thinking of it as a way to get more impressions and rather a way to have a dialogue that we couldn't have had conveniently without, focus groups or flying people to our headquarters.
Right. Yeah. I think that's an interesting point, that you do have a window on what your particular consumer or market is thinking and doing that a lot of us are not using as effectively as we can. So when you're looking at social media performance or any other kind of interaction, you might say, what should you be benchmarking?
Well, I wouldn't say social media in general. I think what marketing needs to start to do is to understand that the most powerful thing that a marketer can do is to grow brand equity or goodwill on the balance sheet. I'll go back to one of my
Right.
favorite cult brands, Airbnb.
Right.
Airbnb is a $3 billion company.
Right.
And when you start looking at their marketing spend, you start to ask yourself, well, what are they doing to generate $3 billion a year of recurring revenue? And the answer is not very much. You don't see a lot of price and promotion. You don't see a lot of features and benefits going on with zero of their paid media or of their mass media. They'll certainly optimize Google keywords. But the marketing team at Airbnb is not trying to drive $3 billion of sales. Airbnb's market capitalization is $101 billion, right? So you start thinking about they are valued as a business 30x their revenue.
Wow.
And with that market capitalization, they can acquire companies, they can attract talent, they can offer ridiculous stock options. It's like that's the health of the business. And so when they sit around trying to say, well, how many opens did that email get? The answer is who the hell cares? I'm not here to optimize email open rates. I'm here to grow market capitalization for the business. And that's the cocktail that's much bigger than any one channel. But the problem is most businesses are organized by channels. They have a social team, a PR team, a newspaper flyer team, an in-store team, an e-commerce team. And so therefore, they're all just optimizing the individual parts, and very few people are actually focusing on the sum of what those things equal. So I'm not saying don't have campaign, KPIs, but we have to swing the pendulum back to where's true value. And that's found when you go public, that's found when you're acquired, or that's found when a disproportionate number of people pay a premium for your stock, which is how Apple got to $3 trillion. It's how Tesla became, more valuable than all the other automotive companies combined. It's not by optimizing, marketing campaigns.
Right. So you're talking about looking at the bigger picture, and really then, if I'm understanding you correctly, to a great extent, not 100%, but to a great extent, your benchmark is really how many people are willing to either pay a premium for your product or pay full price for your product, rather than how many people click or like or open or whatever the case may be.
That's, Jane, good for you. I mean, not many people catch on that quickly, but if you wanted to say you want to know the fastest indicator of the health of your business, the power of your marketing, and whether or not you're reaping cult brand benefits, I'd have you first and foremost look at your pricing in your category. Are you avoiding being the low-cost provider? Second would be the percentage of goods or services you sell at full price, meaning that you're no longer bribing people or having to put constant stimulation into the marketplace, but people are seeking it out to pay full price and often a premium price. And then third, we look at unsolicited resumes or applications to work for you. Again, in terms of building from the inside out, one of those cult brand principles, you want to be able to attract the world's best talent who are knocking on your door saying, I don't even know if you're hiring right now, but I wanted you to have my resume just in case you were. And that, that's always been important. But now, in what they're calling the Great Resignation, when 50% of employees are telling telling surveyors that they're going to be quitting their job in the next 12 months, like just having the competitive advantage of talent and people wanting to work at your company is a huge indicator that your business, I mean, think about advocacy. It's one thing to say, I'm going to buy your stuff. It's another thing to say, I want to work for 40 hours a week at your place of business. That's how much I love who you are and what you're doing. And so it gives these cult brands just a tremendous competitive advantage.
Yeah, I think that's a hidden benefit that we often overlook when, like you say, most of us are really focused on the bottom line, which you can't help be because you've got to survive, right? It's good to build a cult brand, but you have to be able to also survive, till next month or next year. But you're right. There's so many other residual benefits, so to speak, from investing in this. So I would just like to touch on one more thing and go back to, you alluded to this earlier about the importance of consistency and so forth. Perhaps we can just take a look at how long does it take? And I know there's not one set timeline, but to be able to build this kind of a brand, because I think that on the one hand, you're right, it's not an overnight success, but I think people do want to have a ballpark idea of at least a range of a timeline of what you might be thinking to be able to take what you have and get it to where you'd like to be, sort of a zero to hero kind of a thing.
Well, I mean, if you're like, we have an event every year called The Gathering, and it's our opportunity to sort of recognize the most iconic cult-like brands in any given year. And it's really more of a lifetime achievement award. It's not like who did something this year that was worthy of our attention, but I've mentioned many of them today: Coca-Cola, Levi's, right, Porsche, the Dallas Cowboys. They've all sort of been honored in the past. This year, we're honoring TikTok. TikTok would be the fastest brand to have achieved some cult-like status, at least here in North America. TikTok had been around longer in Asia. Right. When it kind of came onto our radar. Prior to that, Airbnb was the fastest at 6 years. TikTok was 2 years. Wow. Airbnb was 6. Yeti was 10. So, but let me say this. There's tremendous benefits on the journey to cult-like status, right? To become iconic, you have to do something so extraordinary, like TikTok becoming the first platform to 1 billion users and, just crushing what Instagram or Snapchat or Facebook had done certainly is extraordinary. But, even though it took, I don't know, pick a brand, UFC, it might have taken, 15 years for UFC to become mainstream, right, but it didn't mean that each year they weren't enjoying tremendously profitable years and displacing competitors and earning an audience. So I don't think that you have to say you need a certain amount of time to get there. And you certainly, once you get there, doesn't mean you can take your foot off the gas, because all you've done is create a playbook that others are now going to want to copy to try to get to your success in the same way that you did. What I would suggest is don't try to grow faster than is natural. The bigger killer to a company is not it takes too long to be a cult brand. It's that my investors had an unreasonable expectation for our growth. And so we did a bunch of things that had short-term benefits that were long-term detriments. And so that's why we fizzled. That's why you have fads. That's why you have so many failures, is because they overdosed on the wrong pills to begin with.
That is so true. I mean, honestly, we could do a whole separate podcast just on examples of that. And exactly right. Chasing dollars for the sake of dollars often leads to that kind of poor judgment and failures, as you're pointing out. Well, Chris, you've shared so many exciting things here. How can people find you? Can you share a web address or other ways for people to get in touch?
Yeah, thank you. So our website is cultideas.com. There's loads of free content, case studies. There's a scorecard that you can fill out to see how cult capable your business may be.
Wow, awesome.
And then you could also, that's obviously where you could reach out and solicit about our consulting services. And then I'd also invite your listeners to check out cultgathering.com, where, again, they can see a lot of these brands that we've talked about and hear directly from the brand leaders themselves. Their CMOs and CEOs are on these stages telling their story and giving just loads of great advice. Much of what I share isn't my own, concoctions. I'm just the messenger regurgitating back the great, pieces of advice that I've learned from just kind of listening to and studying these cult brand leaders themselves.
Well, honestly, you have shared in a relatively short amount of time an absolute gold mine of insights, observations, lots of great energy. I'm pumped up just listening to you. I really want to thank you so much for joining us today, Chris. And I will include all the links in the show notes.
You're very, very welcome. Appreciate you taking the time with me.
If you enjoyed this episode of A Seat at the Table, join me each week when I sit down with industry leaders, innovators, entrepreneurs, and authors who share their expertise, experience, and insights about succeeding in business and in life. And don't forget to check out our podcast website, where you can find all of the previous episodes of the Seat at the Table podcast, the show notes, news about our upcoming masterclass series, and lots of other useful information. You can find it at seat.fm. That's www.seat.fm. FM because it's a podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Jane Singer, and I'll see you in the next podcast episode.